At 2:13 in the morning, Dante Veyron pressed a loaded gun against his wife's forehead in front of every elder who had ever sworn loyalty to his name. He was so certain he had won. Serafina Vale didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She stood beneath the chandelier in the foyer of the Bellavero estate with blood on the marble floor and her husband's weapon inches from her skull. She looked at him the way you look at someone who has already lost and simply hasn't been told yet. "You made one mistake tonight," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "You betrayed the only person who could have saved you." Dante's hand didn't waver, but something behind his eyes did. If you've ever trusted someone with everything you had, your name, your future, your most protected secrets, and watched them turn that trust into a weapon pointed back at you, then you already understand what this story costs. Stay with me until the end. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Because what happened inside the Bellavero estate that night didn't just destroy one man's empire. It dismantled every lie he had told himself about who he was. 3 days before the gun came out, Dante Veyron was in the best mood of his adult life. He sat at the long mahogany table in the private dining room on the second floor of his Chicago headquarters, a building that didn't appear on any city registry and didn't need to, and he was eating a steak that cost more than most people's weekly salary, and he was smiling. Not the practiced smile he wore at public events, not the controlled, deliberate expression he used in negotiations. This was something raw, private. The smile of a man who believed he had finally outmaneuvered everyone in the room. Rocco Marcelli sat across from him, cutting his own meat with the careful, unhurried movements of a man who had learned patience the hard way. Rocco was 41, built like someone had assembled him out of old timber and tension wire, with a jaw like a fist and eyes that had seen enough ugliness to stop registering it. He had been Dante's underboss for 6 years. He had buried problems, managed shipments, maintained the kind of discipline across 4 districts that kept the whole machine from grinding itself apart. Dante trusted him completely. That was the first miscalculation. "He suspects nothing," Dante said, not bothering to lower his voice. The room was swept twice a day. He was comfortable. "I've watched her for weeks. She goes to her charity dinners. She handles the household. She smiles at the right people. She has no idea." Rocco kept his eyes on his plate. "And you're sure about this?" "I'm sure about everything." Dante set his fork down. "Filing is ready. The accounts she has access to. I've already had them restructured. By the time she realizes anything is happening, it'll already be done. And the dinner Friday. Friday is the announcement." Dante reached for his wine. "The elders will be there. The captains. Celeste will be present as my guest. I'll make the situation clear." Rocco looked up then, and something moved across his face, a flicker, small and controlled, gone before Dante could name it. "You're announcing a divorce in front of the entire family. I'm announcing a transition." Dante's voice carried the tone of a man who had decided a thing and was no longer interested in alternative perspectives. "Serafina has been a perfectly adequate wife, but adequate isn't sufficient for what I'm building. The next phase of this organization requires someone who can operate in public-facing spaces without suspicion, someone with social connections that extend beyond what Serafina has ever cultivated. Celeste brings access I can't acquire through any other means." Rocco was quiet for a moment. "And you've thought this through?" "I've thought about nothing else for 4 months. Another pause. Rocco lifted his glass. "Then I suppose congratulations are in order." The flicker was back. Dante didn't catch it. He was already thinking about Friday. Serafina Vale had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not because she couldn't sleep. She had trained herself years ago to sleep on demand, in short, efficient intervals, the way soldiers learn to rest in the field. She was awake, because there were things that required her attention before the household came alive, and she had always preferred to work in the quiet hours when no one was watching. She sat at the desk in her private study on the third floor, a room Dante had never once entered, because he had never once asked what was inside it, with a phone pressed to her ear and a glass of water she hadn't touched yet on the surface beside her. "The account restructuring," she said. "Walk me through the timeline." The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Harlan Foss, 63 years old, a financial architect who had worked for the Vale family for 31 years before Dante Veron ever came into the picture. "He's moving assets through 4 shell entities. The primary rerouting is scheduled to complete within 72 hours. Let it complete. A beat. Let it complete, Harlan. Don't touch any of it." Serafina turned a pen over in her fingers. "I want him to believe it worked." Silence on the line. "He's going to announce it Friday," she continued. "I need the captains informed before 9 a.m. Friday morning. Not after. Before. They need time to make their own decisions about where they stand before they walk into that dining room. And Rocco? Rocco already knows where he stands." She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet, turning the pen in her fingers. Outside the window, Chicago was dark and wet, the kind of November rain that made the city look like it was slowly dissolving into the lake. She had grown up looking at this city from above. She knew its architecture the way surgeons know anatomy, not admiring it, but understanding exactly where to cut. She had married Dante Veron at 26 because the Vale bloodline had obligations that predated any individual's preferences, and because she had assessed him carefully and determined he was capable of managing the visible operations of the Veron nation while she maintained the structural architecture that actually kept it standing. She had not married him believing he loved her. She was honest with herself about that. But she had believed for a period of years that she was no longer able to precisely count that he was at least loyal. She had been wrong about that. She was prepared to accept that error. What she was not prepared to accept was the idea that he would make his move without consequence. She picked up the glass of water, finally drank it, and went back to work. The Friday dinner was held in the main dining hall of the Bellavero estate, a room designed to communicate exactly one thing. This family has survived longer than you have. There were 14 people at the table, the 7 family elders, 4 district captains, Dante at the head, Serafina at the opposite end, in the chair that had always been hers, wearing a gray dress and her grandmother's earrings, and the expression of a woman who was mildly interested in the conversation, but not particularly invested in its outcome. Celeste Arden arrived 40 minutes into the dinner. She was everything Serafina was not: visually bright, theatrical, constructed for public consumption in a way that communicated money and availability in equal measure. She wore red. She touched Dante's shoulder when she entered. She smiled at the table with the kind of confidence that suggested she had already decided how this evening would go. Serafina watched her cross the room and thought, she has no idea either. The announcement came between the second and third courses. Dante stood up from his chair. He didn't clink his glass or call for attention, he simply stood, and the room went quiet, because it always went quiet when Dante Veron stood, because that was a habit the people in this room had spent years cultivating, and habits are hard to break, even when the ground underneath them has already shifted. "There are changes coming to this family," he said. "I want you to hear them from me directly." He looked at Serafina once, just once, and she held his gaze without expression. He talked for 4 minutes. He used careful language transition, restructuring, evolution of the organization. He introduced Celeste without ever using the word replacement. He was precise and composed and thoroughly certain that the room was absorbing his authority. When he finished, the silence lasted 6 full seconds. Elder Carmine Voss, 71 years old, with a white beard and hands that had done things Dante would never fully know about, looked at Serafina across the length of the table. Serafina reached up, unclasped the thin gold chain at her wrist, her wedding bracelet. Not her ring. She had stopped wearing the ring 3 weeks ago without explanation, and set it on the table beside her plate. "Thank you for the dinner," she said. "It was lovely." She stood, excused herself with a nod to the elders that was almost imperceptibly different from the nod she gave Dante, and walked out of the room. Nobody stopped her. Nobody moved at all for a moment, and in that moment, Dante felt something he hadn't expected: a cold, specific unease, like the split second before you step on a stair that isn't there. Then Elder Voss cleared his throat, and the dinner continued. By midnight, 3 things had happened that Dante couldn't explain. His primary financial account, the one managed through a holding company in Luxembourg that he had spent 8 months restructuring specifically to isolate it from Serafina's access, was frozen. Not flagged, not delayed, frozen. His financial manager called him at 11:47 and used the word unprecedented twice in 30 seconds. At 12:15, his logistics coordinator informed him that the 2 shipping routes through the Northern District had been suspended. Both carriers had simultaneously cited contract review clauses that Dante had never seen before. Clauses that had apparently existed in the original agreements and simply never been invoked until tonight. At 12:40, he called Captain Barato to confirm a pickup scheduled for the following morning, and Barato didn't answer. Dante called twice more. The third call went straight to voicemail, with a message that said the number was no longer in service. He stood in the middle of his office at the headquarters building and looked at his phone and felt the cold from the staircase sensations spreading upward through his chest. Was doing this. Someone was doing this. Someone with specific knowledge of the financial architecture, the logistics contracts, and his captain network was dismantling his operation with the precision of someone who had been planning the dismantling for a long time. His first thought was Rocco. He called Rocco immediately. Rocco answered on the second ring, voice even and unhurried. "I heard about the accounts. Where are you?" "At the South facility. There's a situation with the—" "Leave it. Come to headquarters." Dante's voice was controlled, but just barely. "Now." Rocco arrived 20 minutes later, came through the door of Dante's office, and sat down without being invited to, which was unusual, and leaned back in the chair, with his arms resting on the armrests, in a posture that was not quite relaxed, but was not defensive either. Dante studied him for a long moment. "Tell me it wasn't you," Dante said. Rocco met his eyes. "It wasn't me." "Then who has the access?" "I've been trying to figure that out all night." Rocco paused. "Dante, the Luxembourg account. How many people knew the full structure of that account?" "3. You, Harlan Foss, and—" He stopped. Rocco waited. "Harlan wouldn't." Dante's jaw tightened. "He's been with this organization for—" "Harlan Foss worked for the Vale family for 31 years before he ever worked for you," Rocco said. Quietly, precisely. "I pulled his file after the account froze. He came to the Veyron organization as part of the merger, as part of the marriage." The room got very still. Dante sat down. He had never pulled Harlan's file. He had never needed to, or believed he needed to, because Harlan had always been simply there, competent and invisible and utterly reliable, the way certain furniture becomes invisible once you stop noticing it. "You think she's been using him?" Dante said. "I think," Rocco said carefully, "that we should figure out what Serafina actually knows before we assume anything." But Dante's mind had already locked onto a different track. Because if Serafina had access to the Luxembourg account, then the restructuring he had spent 8 months executing hadn't isolated her at all. And if she could freeze the account, she could access it. And if she had known about the restructuring long enough to prepare a countermove, then she had known about his plans long before Friday's dinner, which meant everything he thought he had been doing in secret had been visible to her the entire time. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. 3 words, check the warehouse. He sent 2 men. They called him back in 11 minutes. The warehouse on Calloway Street, a facility that held documentation worth more to the organization than most of its liquid assets, was empty. Not robbed, not broken into. Emptied methodically, with the locks resecured afterward. Dante stood up and put his jacket on. I need to go back to the estate, he said. Rocco didn't move. Dante. She's at the estate. I know where she is. Something in Rocco's voice made Dante turn around. The underboss was looking at him with an expression that was neither hostile nor warm, but was intensely, specifically serious. Before you go, Rocco said, I need to ask you something. What? When you planned the divorce, the accounts, Celeste, did you think about what it would cost her? Dante stared at him. She'll receive a settlement. Terms are, that's not what I'm asking. The silence stretched. I'm going to the estate, Dante said. He left. The drive back to Bellavero took 22 minutes. Felt faster than that because Dante spent the entire drive recalculating, rearranging what he knew into patterns that made sense, looking for the shape of what Serafina had actually done and how far back it went. The problem was that the further back he looked, the more he found. The shipping contract clauses he pulled up, the original agreements on his phone, while the car moved through the rain. Those clauses had been inserted during the initial negotiation 7 years ago. He had signed those contracts. He had read them, or believed he had read them, or had relied on Harlan to read them, which meant he had effectively let Serafina's man read the contracts that were supposed to bind his organization. 7 years. He started running through other documents in his head, other negotiations, other arrangements, where Harlan had been the intermediary, where the details had been handled at a level below Dante's direct attention, because there was always something more immediate, always something that required his focus and his presence and his authority. And the organizational infrastructure could be trusted to Harlan because Harlan was competent and reliable and utterly. Dante pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead. Car stopped in front of the estate. He sat still for a moment. Then he got out. The estate was quiet in a way that felt arranged rather than natural. Staff had been cleared. The lights in the lower floors were reduced to a single corridor running toward the back of the house. Dante moved through the entrance hall and into the main sitting room and found it empty, and then he heard her voice from the study adjacent, not speaking to him. Speaking on the phone, the low, precise cadence of someone issuing instructions. He pushed the door open. Serafina stood at the window with her back to him, still in the gray dress from dinner, one hand holding the phone and the other resting against the glass. When the door opened, she said, "Hold on," into the phone, then turned and looked at Dante with the same expression she had worn across the dinner table, interested but not surprised. "I need to know what you've done," Dante said. "Call you back," she said into the phone, and ended the call and set the phone on the desk beside her. "Counts, the warehouse. Barado." Dante's voice was tight. "Walk me through it." "I'd rather not." "Serafina." "Dante." She said his name the way you say a word you've been thinking about for a long time, evenly, without weight. "What exactly did you expect?" "I expected you to behave like an adult." Something moved across her face. Not anger, something more careful than anger. "I have been behaving like an adult. I've been behaving like an adult for 11 years. I managed the financial relationships you didn't want to manage because they bored you. I maintained the alliances that kept your captains from tearing each other apart twice in the last 4 years. I did the work that doesn't get acknowledged at dinner tables because the people who do it prefer not to be acknowledged." She paused. "And you spent the last 8 months building a plan to throw me away in front of the entire family. You will receive a settlement. I don't want your settlement." The words landed flat and absolute and left no space around them. "Then what do you want?" Dante said. She looked at him for a long moment. And for just a second, 1 second, unguarded, he saw something in her face that wasn't calculation or precision or the controlled architecture of a woman who had spent years preparing for this exact conversation. He saw something that looked like exhaustion. "I wanted you to choose differently," she said. "I gave you every opportunity. I genuinely thought, Dante, that when it came down to it, you would make a different choice. The business required nothing. You required. You wanted more than what you had, because more is the only direction you know how to move. And you decided the thing standing in the way of more was me." She picked up her phone again. "So I moved first." Before he could respond, his own phone lit up. Call from his security chief, a man named Peralta, who never called at this hour, and whose voice, when Dante answered, was stripped down to pure function. "We have a breach," Peralta said. "Armed team, northeast perimeter, at least 16 men. Dante's head came up. "How long? 2 minutes out. Maybe less." He looked at Serafina. She was already walking toward the door with her phone in her hand, and she wasn't moving the way someone moves when they're frightened. She was moving like someone who had just received a signal they'd been waiting for. "Serafina." His voice stopped her in the doorway. "Did you know about this?" She turned. In the dim light of the study, with the rain hitting the windows behind her and the sound of the estate's security system beginning to pulse in the walls, she looked at him with the expression he would replay in his head for the rest of his life. "I know about everything," she said. And then the lights on the ground floor went dark, and somewhere below them, the first shot was fired. And Dante Veyron finally understood that he had walked into the most precisely constructed moment of his entire life, and not one piece of it had been built by him. The first shot came from the east corridor, a single crack that split the quiet of the estate like something breaking that had been under pressure for a long time. Dante moved without thinking. 11 years of surviving in a business where survival required instinct ahead of thought had wired certain responses, so deep they operated below consciousness, and his body was already flattening against the wall of the hallway before his mind had fully registered the sound. He pulled his weapon from the holster at his ribs and checked it in the dark by feel alone. Magazine seated, chamber loaded, safety off, and then he looked up, and Serafina was already moving. Not running, not crouching. Moving with a specific, directed economy that belonged to someone who had a plan and was executing it, which meant she had known this was coming and had prepared for it, which meant the attack on his estate was not a surprise to her at all. And the full weight of that understanding hit Dante somewhere between his stomach and his chest, and he stood there for 1 second longer than he should have. "Don't stop moving," she said without turning around. He followed her. She went left at the end of the corridor, through a door that Dante had always assumed was a linen closet, and which opened instead onto a narrow service staircase he had never known existed. Stairs down without touching the railing, her hand trailing the wall, her footsteps precise and controlled in the dark. "How long have you known about this staircase?" he said. "Since the week we moved in." The staircase opened into the sublevel of the estate, a maintenance corridor that ran the length of the building's foundation, lit by emergency strips along the floor that cast everything in low amber. Dante could hear gunfire above them now, sporadic and then sustained, and the sound of men moving fast across hardwood, and at least one voice shouting orders in a dialect he placed as Northern Italian. "The Sorrento family," he said. "This is a Sorrento operation." Serafina didn't answer. "You knew it was them." He grabbed her arm. She stopped and looked at the hand on her arm, and then looked at him. And the expression was so specifically calibrated, not threatened, not angry, just waiting for him to think about what he was doing, that he released her. You knew. It was the Sorrento family. I knew someone would come eventually, she said. The Sorrento family had more incentive than most. Why? Because of what Celeste told them. Dante went very still. Celeste Arden, Serafina said, turning to face him fully for the first time since they'd left the study, has been working with Marco Sorrento for 14 months. Provided him with partial access to the Veyron account architecture. Not enough to move money, but enough to identify vulnerabilities. She was inside your operation, Dante. She was there specifically to get close enough to do damage. Stared at her. That's not possible. I vetted her. You vetted her the way you vet everything. You asked the people around you to do it, and then trusted the report. Serafina's voice was flat, not cruel, just accurate. Rocco flagged inconsistencies in her background 8 months ago. He brought them to me. He brought them to you, because I asked him to. Corridor was quiet for a moment, except for the distant sounds of the fight above them, and Dante stood in the amber light of the sublevel of his own house and processed the information that his underboss had been reporting to his wife for a period of time that he could not yet calculate, and the cold sensation from the staircase expanded until it had reached most of his body. How long, he said, since the beginning. She said it without flinching. Rocco was my man before he was yours. When the families merged and you took operational leadership, I asked him to stay close to you, protect the organization, to spy on me. To protect the organization, she repeated. Not always the same thing. A burst of gunfire directly overhead, heavy enough that dust shifted from the ceiling. Dante's jaw tightened. He could stand here and continue this conversation, which was dismantling his understanding of the last 6 years, one sentence at a time, or he could deal with the armed men who were currently moving through his house. We need to get to the security room, he said. The security room is already occupied. Peralta has 3 men positioned there, and they're managing the east wing. She was already moving again, further down the corridor. We're going to the control hub. What control hub? She glanced back at him. The one I had built under the East Garden 4 years ago. He followed her in silence, because there was nothing useful to say. The control hub was a room that shouldn't have existed, and it bothered him on a level that had nothing to do with the immediate crisis, that this room was here, underneath his estate, and he had never known, never suspected, never once walked the gardens and wondered what was below the ground. The room was maybe 20 feet square, concrete walls with soundproofing panels, a bank of monitors displaying feeds from cameras positioned at every entry point and corridor of the estate, a communications console, and 2 men Dante had never seen before, sitting at the console with headsets on, speaking in low and rapid exchanges. One of them looked up when Serafina entered. He had the face of a man who had been in rooms like this his entire adult life, careful, experienced, carrying the particular stillness of someone who had learned to manage his own adrenaline. Northeast wing is secure. We've pushed them back to the perimeter on that side. East Garden still active. How many total? We're counting 18, possibly 20. They came in 2 teams, casualties. 2 of ours, minor. 3 of theirs that we can confirm. Serafina nodded and moved to the monitors. Dante stood at the edge of the room and watched her work, and the watching felt different from the way he had watched her before, not the dismissive, ambient awareness of a husband noting his wife's presence, but something sharper and more reluctant, the specific attention you give to something you are being forced to reassess. She moved through the camera feeds with the fluency of someone who had spent time learning them. She identified positions, tracked movement, issued instructions through the communications console in short and specific language. She knew the estate's layout in 3 dimensions. She knew not just the rooms, but the sight lines, the choke points, the places where a man moving through the building would be exposed. and the places where he would have cover. Dante had lived in this estate for 9 years. He knew the dining room and the study and the master bedroom and the route between the garage and the private office. He had never thought about sightlines. "Where's Rocco?" he said. "North corridor," one of the men at the console said. "He's with 2 of the captains. They're holding the main staircase." Dante looked at the monitor showing the north corridor. Rocco was visible in the feed, positioned at the corner of the main staircase, with his weapon up, moving 2 other men into position with hand signals that were precise and economical. He looked entirely in control. He looked like he knew exactly what he was doing. Because he had been preparing for this, Dante realized. They all had. This response, the control hub, the pre-positioned men, the communication system, the camera network, this hadn't been assembled in the hours since the attack began. This had been built over months or years. This was infrastructure. While Dante had been building his plan to restructure the family around himself, Serafina had been building a parallel organization underneath the one he thought he controlled, and the parallel organization was better equipped, better coordinated, and considerably better prepared for the current situation than anything Dante had constructed. He crossed to the monitor bank and stood beside her. "Tell me what you need from me." She looked at him. Something in her assessment was thorough and without sentiment. "The East Garden has 4 men pinned behind the maintenance structure," she said. "Peralta can't spare anyone from the East Wing to push them back. I need someone to move through the sublevel corridor and come up through the garden access point behind their position. I can do that. I know you can. I need you to bring them in alive if possible." The man giving orders, the one in the gray coat. "Camera 4, he's not Sorrento family. He's contracted. I need to know who hired him." Dante looked at camera 4. Gray coat, moving efficiently between positions, using a radio rather than shouting. "Professional. You think this wasn't Sorrento's operation? The Sorrento family doesn't have the access they'd need to know this estate's layout. Someone gave them a blueprint." She kept her eyes on the monitor. "Someone inside the organization." The words settled. Dante looked at the monitor showing the gray-coated man, and then looked at the feeds showing the interior of the estate, Rocco at the staircase, Peralta's men in the East Wing, captains on the upper floor, and felt the cold sensation arrange itself into something more specific. Someone's inside had provided a blueprint. "I'll bring him in," Dante said. He moved back into the sublevel corridor without another word and oriented himself. East Garden access point would be at the far end of the corridor, past the utility intersection. He moved quickly, weapon in front, listening to the sounds of the building above him. The gunfire had become more intermittent, settling into the rhythm of a standoff, rather than an initial breach, which meant both sides were positioning rather than advancing. That gave him a window. The garden access point was a hatch that came up through the floor of a disused groundskeeper's shed at the northeast corner of the East Garden. Dante came up through it slowly, pushed the shed door open 2 inches, and assessed through the gap. The 4 men Serafina had described were positioned behind the maintenance structure 30 feet to his left. He could see Gray Coat among them, standing at the back of the group, radio in hand, facing toward the estate. The man was positioning his team for a second push at the East Wing entry. Dante pushed the shed door fully open and moved. He covered the distance to the maintenance structure before Gray Coat's team registered the movement from behind them, and the first man turned and raised his weapon, and Dante put him down with the butt of his own gun instead of firing, because noise would draw the others back. And then he had his weapon at Gray Coat's throat, and his forearm across the man's chest before anyone in the group had fully processed what was happening. "Weapon down," he said, quietly, precisely. 2 of the 3 remaining men held their positions. The third started to move, and Dante pressed the barrel harder against Gray Coat's jaw. "Tell them," Dante said. A pause. Then Greycoat made a short sound and the third man stopped. "Who hired you?" Dante said. Greycoat said nothing. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Dante said, "and then I'm going to start making decisions you won't enjoy. Who hired you?" Greycoat's breathing was controlled, but his pulse was visible in his throat. Professional. He had been in situations like this before, or situations he thought were like this before. "You're making a mistake," Greycoat said. "Tell me something I haven't heard tonight. I mean specifically. You're standing in the wrong garden, asking the wrong questions because you don't understand what tonight actually is." Greycoat's eyes were steady, and in them, Dante saw something that was not fear and was not defiance, but was something closer to pity. Tonight isn't an attack, it's a demonstration. Dante's grip tightened. "Explain that. We were paid to breach the perimeter and hold position, not to take the building, not to eliminate anyone. Create a situation inside this estate that would require a specific response." Greycoat paused. "We were told the response would be instructive." "Instructive for who?" "For you." The rain was still coming down, flattening Greycoat's hair, running down Dante's collar. The estate was lit from inside in amber, and the sound of sporadic gunfire had nearly stopped. Dante stood in the garden with his weapon against a contractor's jaw and felt the architecture of the evening rearrange itself around him. He had been thinking about tonight as a crisis that had coincided with the confrontation with Serafina. He had been thinking about the two things: the divorce, the attack as a collision of events, terrible timing, his plan meeting an external threat at the worst possible moment. But if Greycoat was telling the truth, then the attack was not a coincidence. The attack was part of her plan. He moved Greycoat through the garden access hatch and into the sublevel corridor and back to the control hub without speaking again. When he pushed the door open and Greycoat saw the room, the monitors, the communications console, Serafina standing at the center of it, he saw the man's professional composure slip for exactly 1 second before he recovered it. Serafina looked at Greycoat and said, "Leon." Greycoat. Leon looked at her with the expression of a man encountering someone he had expected to encounter eventually, but not tonight. "Mrs. Veyron, you can drop the formality. We're past that." She gestured to the chair at the console. "Down." Leon sat. Dante looked at Serafina. "You know him." "I hired him," she said. The room went very quiet. Dante lowered his weapon slowly. "You hired the men who attacked your own estate. I hired contractors to conduct a controlled breach of the perimeter with specific instructions to hold position, avoid lethal engagement where possible, and create enough pressure to ensure that every person inside this building was required to make a choice." She met his eyes without flinching. Under pressure, people stop performing and start revealing. "I needed to know who in this organization was still loyal and who had been reporting to the Sorrento family." "And who was reporting to the Sorrento family?" Dante said. She turned to the monitor bank and brought up a camera feed interior, the main sitting room on the ground floor. On screen, a man Dante recognized as Captain Ferretti was crouched beside the window with his phone out, typing rapidly. "He's been sending position updates since the breach began," Serafina said. "Locations of our men, entry points, the security room location. He's been directing the Sorrento family's real team, which is the one waiting at the outer gate, for a signal that tonight's operation compromised our defenses. Enough for a second assault." Dante stared at the screen. Ferretti. He had known Ferretti for 7 years. He had sat across dinner tables from the man, had entrusted him with district operations worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. "Who else?" Dante said. "Ferretti is the primary conduit. There are 2 others who've been feeding information in smaller capacities over the last year." She paused. "Dante, the access the Sorrento family has been accumulating, the account vulnerability, the operational intelligence Ferretti has been supplying. They were building towards something larger than tonight. Tonight was meant to be the moment of maximum exposure. Your announcement at dinner, the divorce, the public fracture of your authority, they timed this to hit when the organization was most vulnerable. Celeste, Dante said. The word came out like he was testing the weight of it. She was never here for you. Serafina's voice was even. She was here for the accounts. She needed physical proximity to complete the access to credentials she'd been assembling for Marco Sorrento. She would have been gone within 2 weeks of the wedding. Dante pulled a chair out from the console and sat down in it with the specific, careful movement of a man, managing the experience of having the ground removed from beneath him. He put his weapon on the console. He pressed both hands flat against his thighs. He had brought Celeste into the organization. He had sponsored her, vouched for her, built plans around her presence. He had made her the center of his vision for the next phase of his life, and she had been using him as a delivery mechanism from the first conversation they'd ever had. "How long have you known?" he said. "About Celeste specifically." 6 months. 6 months. He repeated it without inflection. "I needed to understand the full scope of the Sorrento operation before I moved. If I'd exposed Celeste too early, Marco Sorrento would have pulled back and rebuilt through a different channel, and I'd have lost the opportunity to identify everyone involved." She turned from the monitors to face him. "So I let it run. I let Celeste get close enough to believe she had what she needed, and I let you believe your plan was working." The words arrived one at a time with enough weight behind each of them to leave marks. "You let me believe," he said. "Yes. You stood in that dining room tonight and took off my bracelet and walked out." Yes, there was something in her voice now that wasn't anger and wasn't satisfaction. It was closer to grief, and it surprised him. "Did you think that was easy for me, Dante? Did you think any of this was easy?" He looked at her. For the first time since the night began, since before the night began, since the months of distance and careful maneuvering, and the dinner and the gun, and all of it, he looked at her, without the interpretive layer of his own certainty about what she was and what she represented. And he saw a woman who was exhausted, who had been holding an extraordinary amount of weight for an extraordinary amount of time, and who had continued to hold it without once letting it show, because letting it show would have cost her everything. Serafina, his phone rang. "Peralta," he answered. "We have a problem," Peralta said. Rocco went to take Ferretti into custody, and Ferretti made a call before they reached him. The outer gate just reported movement. Sorrento's second team is inbound, and they're not a perimeter crew. These are principal fighters. Dante stood up. "How many?" Peralta's estimate is 30. 30 men, organized, incoming, with a traitor inside, who had been feeding them position data for the last hour. He looked at Serafina. She was already back at the monitors, already issuing instructions through the console, already coordinating. Her face in the amber light of the screens was concentrated and certain and completely without panic. Dante put his phone away and picked up his weapon. There was no version of the next hour that allowed him to leave this building. There was no version that allowed him to pretend the last 6 years had been something other than what they were. There was no version in which the man he had believed himself to be in control, in authority, unassailable, survived the night intact. He crossed to the console and stood beside his wife. "Tell me where you need me," he said. She didn't look at him, but something in her shoulders changed. Some fraction of the weight she had been carrying shifting, and she pointed to camera 7, the rear entrance, exposed and unguarded, and said, "There." He went. Dante reached the rear entrance with 40 seconds to spare. He knew this because he counted not deliberately, not as a conscious act of discipline, but because his body had defaulted to the kind of mechanical precision that takes over when the thinking part of a man's brain is too overwhelmed to operate normally. 40 seconds between the moment he left the control hub and the moment He pressed himself against the wall beside the rear entrance door and heard the sound of organized movement on the other side of it. Boots on wet gravel. Multiple men, moving with the specific controlled cadence of people who had done this before, and were not particularly concerned about the outcome. 30 of them, Peralta had said. Dante had his weapon, 2 spare magazines, and no backup because every available man was currently positioned elsewhere in a defensive architecture that Serafina had designed and that had not been built with the assumption that entrance would need to hold alone. He pressed the earpiece Serafina's man had handed him on the way out of the control hub and said quietly, "I'm at the rear. How long before you can redirect anyone?" Her voice came back immediately. 8 minutes. Rocco is dealing with Ferretti, and the north corridor isn't fully secured. 8 minutes is too long. I know, delay them. He looked at the door. Delay 30 professional fighters with a handgun and 2 magazines. He thought about pointing out that this was an unreasonable request and decided there was no version of that conversation that helped anyone. "Fine," he said. He checked the frame of the rear entrance, solid steel, reinforced, hinged inward. The door opened toward him, which meant the first man through would be briefly exposed. He looked at the ceiling. Emergency lighting, the same amber strips as the sublevel. A junction box on the wall to his left. He crossed to it, opened it with the butt of his weapon, and hit the manual breaker. The rear corridor went dark. He moved to the opposite side of the door, 3 feet back, weapon at chest height, and waited. The door came in hard. Someone had hit it with enough force to take it off the hinges, and 2 men came through fast and low and moved immediately left, because that was the instinct. When entering a dark space, move to cover, and Dante was on the right, and the first 3 seconds of the breach went to him entirely. He put the first man down. The second man turned toward the sound, and Dante moved and hit him across the jaw with his forearm and dropped him against the wall. The third man, through the door, had a flashlight attached to his weapon and brought it up, and Dante was already moving out of the beam, further into the corridor, pulling the attention with him and away from the entrance to the sublevel. He was buying time. Edie's. It was ugly work, the kind that leaves marks you carry for a while, and he was doing it in the dark in a corridor of his own house that he had never properly learned because he had never imagined needing to. His earpiece crackled. Dante. Serafina's voice had changed, still controlled, but something underneath the control had shifted. "We have a problem." He pressed himself into a doorway as another flashlight beam swept the corridor. "I currently have several." Rocco found something on Ferretti. Before they could bring him in, Ferretti destroyed his phone. Rocco recovered partial data from the SIM. A pause, brief, but for Serafina significant. The Sorrento operation tonight was not funded by Marco Sorrento. Dante went still. "Say that again." "Marco Sorrento has been dead for 6 weeks. Cancer. The operation tonight is being run by his son, Elia Sorrento. But the funding the account trails. Harlan traced before tonight started. The money came from inside the Veyron organization, from a shell entity that was created 4 years ago and has been dormant until 3 months ago." The flashlight beam swept past the doorway and moved on. "Whose entity?" Dante said. Another pause. Longer this time. "It's registered to a trust," she said. "The controlling beneficiary of the trust is listed as the estate of Aldrich Veyron, Dante's father. Dead 9 years. "That's not possible," he said. "The trust was established 2 years before your father died. The signature is his, but the language was drafted by someone else. Harlan recognized the structure. It was built to activate on a specific trigger condition." Her voice was steady but stripped down to its essential elements, the way voices get when someone is managing information too large for the normal containers. "The trigger was the dissolution of your marriage." Dante stood in the dark doorway of his own house, with gunfire beginning again at the far end of the corridor and process the information that his father, 11 years in the ground, a man Dante had eulogized as the architect of everything the Veyron family stood for, had built a mechanism designed to destroy the organization if Dante ever moved against Serafina. He knew, Dante said. He knew you. Serafina's voice, for just a moment, carried something that wasn't triumph or bitterness. It was sadder than either. He knew what you were capable of, and he built a contingency. A man came around the corner with a flashlight and found Dante and raised his weapon, and Dante moved first, put him against the wall, took the flashlight, kept moving toward the sublevel access point, because 8 minutes was up, and he needed to get back to the control hub, and he needed to see the documentation himself, because some information has to be verified with your own eyes before your brain will accept it. He came back through the sublevel corridor at a run, hit the control hub door, and stopped in the frame. The room was different from when he'd left it. Rocco was there, standing against the far wall with his arms crossed, and the specific expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has decided to set it down regardless of where it lands. Leon Gray Coat, the contractor, was still at the console. One of Serafina's communication men was at the monitors, and at the center of the room, standing with a tablet in her hand displaying a document that Dante could see from the doorway, was dense with legal language, was Serafina. And beside her, seated in the chair that had previously been empty, was Celeste Arden. Dante looked at Celeste. Celeste looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had decided that the performance was over and was experiencing the specific, almost physical relief of dropping it. She was still in the red dress from dinner, but one sleeve was torn, and there was a cut along her jaw that had bled down her neck. She had been brought in from somewhere inside the estate, which meant someone had apprehended her after the breach began, and she had not come willingly. "Sit down, Dante," Serafina said. He sat down. "Tell him what you told me," Serafina said to Celeste. Celeste looked at Dante for a long moment. She had a glass of water in front of her that she hadn't touched, and she looked at it now, then looked back up. "I wasn't Elia Sorrento's operative," she said. "That's what I told him I was. That's what he believed." "Then whose operative were you?" Dante said. "Nobody's." She said it flatly. "I'm freelance. I identify opportunities, and I sell access to the highest bidder. Sorrento bid high, but he wasn't the only one." Dante's hands on the table were completely still. "Who else?" Celeste looked at Serafina with an expression that was almost apologetic. Then she looked back at Dante. "Your cousin, Raphael Veyron. He approached me 14 months ago, 3 months before Sorrento did. He knew about the trust your father established. He'd known about it for years. He was present when it was drafted, Dante. He was 17 years old, and he was in the room when your father sat down with the lawyers and built the contingency." Dante said nothing. He was very aware of his own breathing. Raphael Veyron was 30 years old. He ran the Western District. He had been at Sunday dinners and organizational meetings and Christmas tables for Dante's entire adult life. He was the son of Dante's father's brother, a man who had died young and left Raphael with nothing and no direct claim to the Veyron name beyond blood. Raphael told Sorrento about the trust trigger, Celeste continued. He explained that, if your marriage dissolved, a funded operation would activate against the organization. Sorrento saw an opportunity. If he could use the trust's own mechanism to destabilize the family, frame it as an internal collapse, he could move into the vacuum. She paused. Raphael's arrangement with Sorrento was that he would receive control of the western and northern districts after the family fractured. "And your arrangement with Raphael," Serafina said. Not a question, a prompt. Celeste's jaw tightened. "Raphael paid me to get close enough to Dante to accelerate the divorce timeline, to make sure the trigger activated on schedule." Dante looked at the glass of water in front of Celeste for a long time. The sounds of the fight outside had changed again. More distant, now the second team, being pushed back or having pulled back. He couldn't tell which from inside the hub. He was aware of Rocco against the wall, still and watchful. He was aware of Serafina beside him, standing with the tablet at her side, watching him absorb. Raphael knew about the trust, Dante said finally, and he used it. He's been planning this since your father died, Serafina said. The trust was your father's protection mechanism for the organization. Raphael weaponized it. Where is he now? The words came out with an absolute and specific flatness that contained no interrogative quality at all. It was not a question. It was the beginning of a decision. That, Serafina said carefully, is where it becomes complicated. She set the tablet on the table in front of him. He looked at it. On screen was a real-time location, a tracker, showing a signal moving through the eastern edge of Chicago in a vehicle traveling at highway speed. He left the city 40 minutes ago, Serafina said. He had a car waiting. He's been monitoring tonight's operation through Ferretti's updates. When the second team was pushed back and the breach failed, he ran. Dante stared at the moving dot on the screen. His cousin, 30 years old, Western District, Sunday dinners. Standing in a lawyer's office at 17, watching an old man draft a mechanism for organizational destruction and filing that information away for 13 years, like a seed in dry ground, waiting for the right conditions. You knew about Raphael, Dante said. Serafina was quiet for exactly the right amount of time to confirm it without saying it. How long? I suspected him for 2 years. I had confirmation 4 months ago, and you didn't tell me. I told you what you needed to know when you needed to know it. Her voice was even. If I had told you 4 months ago, you would have confronted him immediately, and he would have known his cover was broken, and everything he had built with Sorrento would have gone underground before I could map the full network. Dante pushed back from the table. He stood up. He crossed to the opposite wall and put his back to it because he needed something solid behind him. And he needed to not be looking directly at anyone for a moment, In the span of a single night, he had discovered that his financial infrastructure had been accessible to his wife for their entire marriage, that his underboss had been reporting to her since before the organization merged, that the woman he had planned to remarry was a paid operative, that his cousin had spent 13 years constructing a betrayal using his own father's legal architecture, and that Serafina had known or suspected most of this for months and had chosen to manage it rather than disclose it. He was standing in a room underneath his own house that he hadn't known existed, and everything he had believed about the shape of his world was wrong, and the specific quality of that wrongness was not the simple wrongness of a man who has been deceived by enemies. It was the wrongness of a man who had been protected by someone he dismissed, and whose protection had cost the protector more than he would ever fully know. His earpiece crackled. Peralta's voice. Dante, we've secured the east garden and the rear entrance. The second team has retreated to the outer perimeter, but Peralta needs a call on Ferretti. Do we hand him to the authorities or handle internally? Dante looked at Serafina. Authorities, she said before he could speak. We have the phone data. It's enough to put him away for a long time without implicating the organization. Clean. Dante pressed the earpiece. Authorities. Package it for an anonymous delivery. He lowered his hand. Rocco straightened from the wall. What about Raphael? Dante looked at the tracker on the tablet. The dot was still moving east, steady and unhurried, a man who believed he had enough distance to breathe. I need to think, Dante said. You have maybe 2 hours before he crosses state lines, and the complexity multiplies significantly, Rocco said. Not pressing, just informational, the way Rocco delivered most things. I know the timeline. Celeste cleared her throat. Everyone looked at her. She had the expression of someone calculating whether a piece of information is worth offering. And she had apparently decided it was. Raphael has the original documents from your father's trust. physical copies. He took them from the family archive. 6 months ago, I saw them when he briefed me. If he gets those documents to Sorrento's lawyers, they can use them to initiate a formal challenge to the organization's structure. A legal claim that the trust's activation entitles the Sorrento family to a receivership position over Veyron assets. The room absorbed this. They'd be tying it up in court for years, Rocco said. With a legitimate legal instrument signed by Aldrich Veyron, Serafina said quietly. Which means any court proceeding becomes a public examination of the organization's financial structure. She looked at Dante. It would be the end, not a violent end, a procedural one. Slower, worse. Dante looked at the tracking dot on the tablet. 2 hours. He thought about his father, a man he had understood or believed he had understood, as a pragmatist above all things. A man who had built this organization out of raw and violent material and had held it together through force of will and the kind of relationships that don't get recorded anywhere. A man who had, apparently, loved this organization enough to build a dead man's switch into it and had trusted Serafina Vale enough to make her the key. The key, Dante thought. Not the lock. The key. His father had looked at Serafina at 26 years old and had seen something that Dante, living beside her for 11 years, had managed not to see until tonight. Picked up the tablet. Rocco, he said. Yeah, get the car. Rocco pushed off the wall without another word and moved toward the door. Dante Venner chinned. Dante looked at Serafina. She was watching him with the specific attention she had been giving him since the night began, not warm, not hostile, something more complicated, something that was waiting to see what he was going to be. I need those documents before he crosses the state line, Dante said, and I need him to understand that whatever he thought he built is done. He paused. I'm not asking for permission. I know you're not, she said, but nothing. Go. She looked at the tablet in his hands. The tracker is linked to my system. I'll monitor from here and route you if he changes direction. He moved toward the door. Dante stopped. She crossed to him in 3 steps and held out her hand. In her palm was a second earpiece, a different one from the communications network he'd been using, smaller, a direct line rather than a shared channel. This one goes only to me, she said. Not to Rocco, not to Peralta. To me. He took it from her hand. Their fingers didn't touch, or barely touched, the kind of contact that registers and then immediately becomes uncertain in memory. He put it in his ear and walked out. The sublevel corridor was quiet. Rocco was at the far end, already moving, and Dante followed him through the dark, with the tracker glowing in his hand and the weight of the night pressing down on his shoulders with the specific density of everything he still didn't know. Came up through the groundskeeper's shed and into the east garden, and the rain had lightened to a mist that sat low over the ground, and the estate behind him was lit and marked from the night's work, and everything that had happened inside it in the last several hours had rearranged the world into a shape he was still learning to read. He got into the car. Rocco pulled out of the gate without being told where to go, because Serafina's system had already pushed the route to the navigation display. Because, of course, it had, because the control hub was operational, and she was in it, and she had thought of this before they had. The city moved past the windows, wet and amber and indifferent. Dante looked at the tracker and watched his cousin's position move steadily east toward the state line, carrying documents that could unravel everything, and he felt something clarify inside himself, not rage, not the hot and directionless fury of a man who has been embarrassed and wants to destroy the source of the embarrassment. Something colder, something that had been burned clean by the hours of the evening until only its essential element remained. He had been wrong about everything, not partially wrong, not wrong in the correctable ways that most men are wrong. Wrong at the foundation about what the organization was, about who held it together, about what his own role within it had actually been. His father had known. Serafina had known. The only person who had not known was Dante Veyron, who had spent 11 years believing he was the weight-bearing wall of everything his family built, when in fact he had been what? Decorative. Functional in the way that a lock is functional. Visible and apparently in control, while the key that operated him had been standing in the next room the entire time. The earpiece in his ear was silent. He pressed it once, a small contact, just enough to confirm the connection was live. Serafina's voice came back immediately. Low and even, I'm here. He didn't say anything. There was nothing yet. That was the right thing to say. But he kept his finger against the earpiece for another second, before he lowered his hand, and the car moved through the wet dark of the city toward whatever was left of the night. And Dante Veyron sat in the passenger seat and began, slowly and without any illusion of comfort, the work of understanding what he had actually been. The tracker put Raphael 11 miles east of the city limit, moving at a steady 60 miles an hour on a route that would reach the Indiana border in approximately 90 minutes. Rocco drove at 80. The city fell away behind them, in fragments, the last gas stations, the last clusters of light, and then the flat dark of the interstate stretching ahead, with nothing on either side but wet November fields and the occasional overpass casting a shadow across the headlights. Dante watched the tracker and said nothing. Rocco drove and said nothing. The radio was off. The only sound was the engine and the tires on wet asphalt and the faint static of the earpiece against Dante's jaw. Then Serafina's voice, he's slowing. Exit 47. There's a truck stop at the end of the ramp. Rocco checked the navigation without being told and adjusted lanes. Why is he stopping? Dante said. Either he doesn't know he's being tracked and he needs fuel, or he does know and he's making a call. A pause. Raphael is careful. Assume the second. If he knows we're behind him, then someone told him, which means there's a communication channel we haven't closed. Another pause. Shorter. Dante. Ferretti made calls before Rocco got to him. We recovered what we could from the sim, but not everything. It's possible Raphael received a warning. Dante looked at the tracker. The dot had stopped. Exit 47, end of the ramp, a truck stop marked on the map with a fuel icon and a diner symbol. He's waiting, Dante said. Or meeting someone. Rocco took the exit without being asked. The ramp curved down from the interstate into a service road that ran flat and lit by sodium lamps towards the truck stop. A wide lot with 6 or 7 semi-trucks parked in a row along the far edge, a fuel canopy in the center, and a low building with a diner attached, whose windows were yellow and whose parking lot had 4 civilian vehicles in it. Raphael's car was one of them. A dark sedan, parked at the edge of the lot away from the diner windows, engine off. No visible movement inside. Rocco pulled into the lot and stopped 50 yards from Raphael's car and cut the headlights. They sat in the dark for a moment. He sees us, Rocco said. Probably. Dante opened the car door. Stay here. That's a bad idea. Stay here. He got out. The mist had thickened in the hour since they'd left the estate, and the air at the truck stop carried the smell of diesel and wet concrete and something fried from the diner's ventilation. Dante walked across the lot toward Raphael's car, with his weapon holstered and his hands visible, and the specific deliberate pace of a man who has decided that arriving at whatever this is in a controlled manner matters more than arriving fast. He was 15 feet from the car when the driver's door opened. Raphael Veyron was 30 years old, but tonight he looked older, not aged in the way exhaustion ages a face, but compressed, like someone had applied pressure to him from multiple directions simultaneously, and the result was a density that hadn't been there before. He was wearing a dark jacket, and he had a bag on the seat behind him, and he stood beside the open door of the car and watched Dante cross the remaining distance with an expression that was not quite defiance, and not quite guilt, but was in the vicinity of both. You moved fast, Raphael said. I had good information. Dante stopped 6 feet away, close enough to read the face, far enough to have a second if the hands moved wrong. The bag. Is that the documents? Raphael looked at him for a long moment. You know about the documents. I know everything, Raphael. That's the part you miscalculated. Something shifted in Raphael's face, a small recalibration, the expression of a man adjusting to the discovery that the ground is not where he put it. Celeste, among others. Raphael exhaled through his nose and looked at the lot around them, the trucks, the fuel canopy, the lit windows of the diner. A visual sweep measuring. Dante noted it. You came alone, Raphael said. Rocco's in the car. Just Rocco. That's all I needed. Raphael looked at him steadily. You should have brought more people, Dante. The sound of a truck door opening behind Dante registered a half-second before his body responded, and he was already moving sideways when the man came around the front of the nearest semi with a weapon raised, and the shot went wide and hit the asphalt 6 inches from where Dante had been standing, and Dante drew and put the man down in 2 steps, not a kill shot, a leg. The man going down hard and staying down, and making the specific sound of someone encountering pain at a volume they hadn't anticipated. Dante turned back to Raphael. His weapon was up now, and his breathing had jumped, but his hands were completely still. Raphael hadn't moved. That was Sorrento's man, Raphael said. Not mine. Try again. I'm serious. Raphael's voice was tight, but the tightness was something other than deception. It was closer to fear, and not fear of Dante specifically. Fear of something adjacent. Elia Sorrento sent him. I didn't know he was here. He looked at the man on the ground, and then back at Dante. Elia doesn't trust me any more than you do. He wanted insurance. Insurance on what? On the documents. Raphael's jaw worked for a moment. On me delivering them. He's been worried I'd change my mind. Dante studied him. 11 years at dinner tables. 11 years of Sunday afternoons and organizational meetings where Raphael had sat in the lower chairs and listened more than he spoke and had seemed, always, like a man who had accepted the particular geography of his position. Younger cousin. Secondary claim. Useful but not essential. 13 years of sitting with a secret like a coal in his pocket, waiting for the temperature to change. You were 17, Dante said. Raphael blinked. What? When my father drafted the trust. You were 17, and you were in the room. Dante kept his weapon level. Why were you in the room? Something crossed Raphael's face that was harder to categorize than anything Dante had seen tonight. It was old. It had been living in the man for a long time, and it showed, briefly before Raphael controlled it. Your father brought me in. He said I was old enough to understand the family's obligations. A pause. He meant he wanted someone to witness it who wasn't a lawyer. Someone who would remember. He trusted me with it, and you used it. I used what I had. Raphael's voice gained an edge. What did you think I was going to do, Dante? Sit in the Western District for 30 more years, running your errands and watching you dismantle everything our grandfather built? He stopped himself, breathed. You were going to sell her out. You were going to push Serafina out of the family and bring in a woman who was already working against you. Did you even think for 1 second about what that would do to the organization? About what the elders would do? About the signal it would send to every family watching from the outside? You didn't do this for the organization. No. The word was flat and final. I did it for myself. I had the lever and I used it. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it was noble. Dante took 2 steps forward. The weapon stayed up. Raphael held his ground, which took something, because Dante at this distance and this angle was not a comfortable thing to hold ground against. Give me the bag, Dante said. Raphael looked at him. Raphael. If I give you the bag, Raphael said slowly. Elia Sorrento still has copies of the trust documents. Celeste photographed them before she passed them to me. That was her insurance. He let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. The originals are in the bag. The copies are with Sorrento's lawyers in Indianapolis. You take the bag. You've got the originals, but you haven't got the problem. Dante's earpiece, Serafina's voice, low and immediate. I heard that. Harlan has contacts at the firm in Indianapolis. Give me 20 minutes. 20 minutes. He looked at Raphael. The bag. Raphael reached into the car and took it out and held it across the space between them. Dante took it with his left hand, weapon still in his right, and slung it over his shoulder. What happens now? Raphael said. Dante looked at his cousin, at the face he had known, since Raphael was a child at family gatherings. Serious-faced even then, always watching, always calculating the distance between where he was and where he believed he should be. A hand shaped by proximity to something he had never been allowed to hold. That didn't excuse 13 years of construction. It didn't excuse the dead outside the estate, or Ferretti, or Celeste, or any of it. But it explained the shape of the thing, and Dante had spent enough of tonight learning to see shapes clearly that he wasn't going to stop now. Get back in the car, Dante said. Drive back to Chicago. Go to the estate and wait. Raphael stared at him. That's it. That's it for tonight. What happens after tonight is not a conversation for a truck stop parking lot. Dante lowered his weapon. But Raphael, if you run, I will find you in whatever city you land in, and the conversation will be shorter and considerably less pleasant. Raphael looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating again, finding that the ground is still not where he put it, but in a different direction than before. Then he got back in the car. Dante walked back to Rocco. Rocco looked at the bag and then at Dante and didn't ask. He started the car. They were back on the interstate heading west, when Serafina's voice came through the earpiece again. Harlan reached the firm in Indianapolis. It took him 8 minutes. 3 of the 4 partners. There were clients of the Vale family before the merger. A beat. The copies have been withdrawn and destroyed under instruction from the trust's original legal custodian, which is a position Harlan has technically held since your father's death. Ilya Sorrento's lawyers have nothing. Dante exhaled. It was the first time he had fully exhaled in what felt like several hours. The original trust, he said. With the documents from the bag, can Harlan dissolve it? It requires the signature of the controlling beneficiary of the Vale bloodline, she said. Which is me. A pause. I'll dissolve it tonight. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say thank you. He wasn't sure thank you was the right instrument for what he was feeling, and he didn't want to use the wrong instrument. They drove in silence for a while. The city reappeared on the horizon, the specific orange glow of Chicago pressing up against the low clouds, visible from miles away, like something that had been burning for a long time. Dante watched it come closer and held the bag on his lap and thought about his father. Aldrich Veyron had built the trust as a dead man's switch. Yes, a contingency, but a contingency designed around the assumption that Serafina would survive whatever Dante did, which meant his father had looked at that 26-year-old woman and assessed her the way you assess load-bearing infrastructure, not with admiration, but with confidence, with the specific certainty that she would be standing when other things had fallen. He had been right. He was always right, Dante thought, even from 9 years in the ground. Rocco took the exit back toward the estate without being directed, and as they came through the outer gate, the gate that had been holding against Sorrento's second team 3 hours ago, and was now manned by 2 of Serafina's people, Dante saw the estate differently than he had ever seen it. Not as the thing he owned, as the thing that had persisted despite him. They came through the main entrance, and Peralta met them in the foyer, and Peralta's face had the careful arrangement of a man delivering information he has pre-processed for efficiency. The east wing damage is contained. We have 2 men at the hospital, neither critical. The bodies from the garden have been handled. He looked at the bag. Yes, and Raphael. He's coming in. Dante moved past Peralta toward the corridor. When he arrives, put him in the east sitting room. Comfortable, not detained, but not free to leave. Peralta absorbed this, and nodded, and went to make that happen. Dante took the stairs to the third floor. Study Serafina's study, the room he had never entered because he had never asked, was lit from within, and the door was open. For the first time in his memory, or perhaps it had always been open, and he had never once looked in that direction. She was at the desk, with her phone and 2 legal documents spread across the surface in front of her, and Harlan Foss was on speaker, walking through the dissolution language, and she was reading while she listened with a pen in her hand, making notations in the margins. And she looked up when Dante appeared in the doorway. They looked at each other across the room. "Hold on, Harlan," she said, and muted the call. Dante crossed the room and set the bag on the desk in front of her. She looked at it. She looked at him. "No casualties," he said. "I know. Peralta updated me." She looked at his hands. He followed her gaze and saw what she was looking at, a cut across his knuckles from the encounter in the corridor that he hadn't registered until now, dried blood along the edge of the skin. She opened a desk drawer and produced a cloth without comment and held it out. Took it. He pressed it against his knuckles. "Raphael is coming in," he said. "I heard. I need to understand what to do with him." She looked at him steadily. "What do you want to do with him?" "I want to—" He stopped. He had been about to say something that was the honest first answer, the instinct-level answer, the one that didn't account for anything he had learned tonight. He pressed the cloth harder against his hand. "I don't know yet." She nodded, not approving, not judging, just receiving the honesty of it. "The elders are going to want a full accounting," she said. "Tomorrow. They've been patient tonight because they trust the outcome, but they'll want to understand what happened and what it means for the structure going forward." She paused. "They'll want to know where authority sits, and where does it sit?" She looked at him with the patience of someone who has answered this question already in every way that matters, and is waiting for the other person to hear it. His earpiece crackled, not Serafina's line, the general channel. Peralta's voice. "Raphael Veron has entered the estate. He's in the east sitting room." Dante looked at Serafina. She looked at him. "Harlan," she said, unmuting the call, "I'll sign in 10 minutes." She capped her pen. The house around them was quieter than it had been in hours, settling back into itself after the violence of the night, the way a body settles, after a fever breaks, not recovered, not whole, but past the worst of it and beginning the long calibration back toward something functional. Somewhere below them, Rocco was debriefing Peralta. Somewhere outside, the estate's perimeter was being resecured. Somewhere, in the east sitting room, Raphael was sitting with the specific stillness of a man who has run and been returned, and is now waiting to discover the shape of his consequences. And in this room, Serafina Vale was signing a legal document that would dissolve a dead man's contingency and close the last exploitable mechanism in the Veron organization's architecture. And Dante stood at the edge of her desk, with a cloth pressed to his knuckles, watching the pen move. When she finished, she set the pen down and looked at the documents for a moment. Then she looked up at Dante and said, in the same even, precise voice she used for everything, "I need you to come with me to the elder meeting tomorrow." "As what?" She held his gaze. "As yourself. Whatever that means now." The question landed without anywhere comfortable to rest, because the answer, what Dante Veron was now, what remained of the man he had been before this night, reorganized. Everything was not yet something he could articulate. He was standing in a room he hadn't been allowed into, and holding a cloth against a wound he hadn't noticed receiving, in a house that had survived the night because of a woman he had spent years underestimating, and the full accounting of what that cost was going to take considerably longer than one night to calculate. "Be there," he said. She nodded and reached for her phone to finalize the call with Harlan, and Dante turned toward the door. "Dante." He stopped. She didn't look up from the phone. but her voice, for one unguarded second, carried something that wasn't instruction or assessment, or the controlled precision of a woman managing an organization. It carried something that had been pressed flat for a long time and had not, apparently, been entirely extinguished. "I'm glad you came back tonight," she said. From the perimeter. From Raphael. A pause, brief and precise. "I'm glad you came back." Stood in the doorway of her study, with the cloth in his hand, and the city visible through the window behind her, and the sounds of his house resettling around them both. And he understood that she was not talking only about tonight. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything yet that was the right thing. He walked out and went downstairs to the east sitting room, and the door was closed, and inside was Raphael, and inside was everything that still had to be answered before morning. And Dante put his hand on the door handle and felt the full weight of what he was walking into, not a confrontation, not a judgment, not the kind of encounter that ends cleanly, and he pushed the door open and stepped through it into the last conversation of the longest night of his life. Raphael was sitting in the chair nearest the window, with his jacket still on, and the bag empty now, the documents gone on the floor beside him. And he looked up when Dante entered with the expression of a man who has had enough time alone to move past fear into something more resigned and more honest. Dante closed the door behind him. He didn't sit immediately, crossed to the side table and poured 2 glasses of water from the pitcher Peralta had left. And he carried both across the room and set one in front of Raphael and took the chair opposite him and sat down. Raphael looked at the water. Then he picked it up and drank half of it in one pull, and Dante understood from that single gesture that his cousin had been more frightened tonight than he had allowed to show in the parking lot. "The documents are dissolved," Dante said. "The trust, the copies in Indianapolis, all of it. Done." Raphael set the glass down. "Then you don't need me for anything. That's not why you're here." "Then why am I here?" Dante looked at him. The room was quiet, a sitting room that had hosted family gatherings for years. Comfortable furniture, the kind of space designed for conversations that don't happen in offices. He had chosen it deliberately, and the choice had come from something he was still learning to identify in himself. Some instinct that said the nature of this particular conversation required a room without a desk between them. "Tell me when it started," Dante said. "Not the plan. The decision. When did you decide?" Raphael was quiet for long enough that the questions seemed to settle into the furniture around them. Then he looked at his hands. "The night of your father's funeral." Dante waited. "You gave the eulogy," Raphael said. "You talked about legacy. You talked about what the family was built on and what it would become. You used the word mine 7 times, I counted." He looked up. "Not ours, mine, my organization, my future, my name. And your father was in the ground that morning, and I was sitting 3 rows back, and I had been in that lawyer's office 2 years earlier when the old man looked at me across the table and said, 'Raphael, I'm trusting you with this because you understand something my son hasn't learned yet.'" He paused. "That was the night I decided." Dante felt the words land with the specific weight of things that are true and unwelcome. He didn't deflect them. "What did my father tell you that day?" he said. "In the lawyer's office. What did he say?" Raphael turned the glass in his hands. "He said the organization would survive him if 2 conditions held. First, that Serafina was protected. Second, that whoever sat at the head of the table understood the difference between authority and ownership." He looked at Dante directly. He said he wasn't certain you'd learn that difference on your own. He said he hoped he was wrong. The room held that. Dante looked at the window. Outside, the mist had settled into a low fog that absorbed the estate's exterior lighting and returned it as a diffuse amber glow, and the gardens beyond, the same gardens where men had positioned and fired and been pushed back hours ago, were invisible. Beneath it, the violence of the night already subsumed into the ordinary darkness. "He wasn't wrong," Dante said. Raphael looked at him. "My father, He wasn't wrong about me. Dante brought his eyes back from the window. I spent 11 years doing exactly what he was afraid of. I treated the organization like a possession. I treated Serafina like an accessory. I built a plan to discard her in front of the entire family and replace her with a woman who was using me as a delivery mechanism. He paused. So he wasn't wrong. Raphael said nothing for a moment. Then, carefully, "That's the first honest thing I've heard you say about yourself. Been a night for honesty. What does that mean for me?" Dante looked at his cousin, at the man who had spent 13 years carrying a secret and sharpening it into a weapon, and had ultimately aimed it in a direction that had cost lives and nearly destroyed the thing he claimed to care about. The anger was still there. Dante wasn't pretending otherwise, wasn't performing a generosity he hadn't yet earned. But underneath the anger was something more complicated, and the most complicated part of it was this: Raphael had been right. Not about the method, not about Sorrento, not about Celeste, not about any of the apparatus he had constructed, but about the diagnosis, about what Dante had been doing and what it would cost. A man can be right about everything important and still do unforgivable things with the rightness. "You brought Sorrento into this organization," Dante said. "2 of my men are in the hospital tonight. One of Serafina's people took a round in the shoulder that will keep him out of commission for 3 months. Ferretti is going to prison." He kept his voice level. "That's the accounting. Whatever you believed about your reasons, that's what they cost." Raphael's jaw was tight. "I know. The elders meet tomorrow. They'll want to understand the full picture. I'm going to give them the full picture." He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "That includes your role. I won't protect you from that accounting. I'm not asking you to. But I'm also not going to let Serafina make the decision about what happens to you without your voice in the room." He watched Raphael process that. "You're going to be there tomorrow. You're going to say what you said to me tonight, not the plan, not the justifications, the truth, what you saw, what you decided, what it cost." Raphael looked at him with the specific attention of someone trying to locate the architecture of an unexpected offer. And then the elders decide, and Serafina decides, and I will tell them what I think, which is this. Dante sat back. "You were a 17-year-old boy who was handed a piece of information by a man he respected, and you carried it for 13 years, and what you did with it was wrong. But the thing underneath it, the thing about what this organization had become, and who was running it, and how that thing was not wrong." He paused. "And I think you know that the only reason you're sitting in this room instead of a worse room is because you're the only person in the last 11 years who was angry enough about the right things to do. Something about them, even if what you did was disastrous." Raphael stared at him. "That's not absolution," Dante said. "Don't mistake it for that. I'm not." "Good." They sat with it for a moment, the two of them, in the quiet sitting room with the fog outside, and the cost of the night settling into the space between them. Then Raphael said, "What happens to you?" Dante considered the question. "I don't know yet. That's Serafina's meeting tomorrow, not mine. I'll be there because she asked me to be, and because I owe the elders a full accounting of my own decisions, which are considerably more embarrassing than yours. Structurally speaking." He almost smiled. Didn't quite make it to his face, but it was close. "I spent 8 months building a plan to restructure, operate around a paid operate, while my wife was running a parallel intelligence operation inside my own house. That's going to be a difficult presentation." Something shifted in Raphael's face, not quite humor, but adjacent. The first human thing he had shown all night that wasn't fear or calculation. "She's extraordinary," he said. And then, as if catching himself, "She always was." "I know." The words came out quiet and completely without performance. "I know that now." Dante stood. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his water glass and finished what was in it. "Get some sleep," he said. "The elder meeting is at 10. Peralta will make sure you have a room." Raphael looked up at him from the chair. Dante. He stopped, seemed to search for something. For what it's worth, I didn't want anyone to get hurt. That was never... Get some sleep, Raphael. He left the room and pulled the door closed behind him. The hallway was quiet. Peralta was at the end of it, waiting with the particular patience of a man who has learned to wait, appearing to wait, and Dante walked toward him and said, "Make sure he has a room, and make sure someone is outside the door, not to guard him, to make sure he doesn't make any decisions in the night that he can't take back." Peralta nodded and went. Dante stood alone in the corridor for a moment. The house was its quietest, now the deep quiet of a place that has been through something and is resting. He could hear, distantly, the sound of Rocco's voice from somewhere on the ground floor, the low-register debrief continuing. He walked back upstairs. Serafina's study door was still open. She was at the desk with the signed dissolution document stacked neatly to one side and a freshly gulphead in front of her, already making notes for the morning. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. "How is he?" she said. "Honest, finally." She considered that. Good. Dante looked at her across the room. At the desk that was covered in the evidence of the work she had been doing for years in this room while he had been 2 floors below, believing himself to be in control of something she had been holding together with both hands. "The elder meeting," he said. "Tomorrow at 10. Yes. Be there." "I know." He stayed in the doorway for another moment. There were things he could say, things that were true and that deserved saying, but the night had been long, and they were both carrying more than could be addressed in a doorway before sleep, and he was learning, slowly and imperfectly, the difference between the right thing and the right time for it. "Good night, Serafina," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Good night, Dante." He turned and walked down the hall to the room that had been his for 11 years, and he sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, without taking his jacket off, and he looked at the floor, and outside the fog pressed against the windows, and the city hummed beneath it, and tomorrow was 10 hours away, and everything that had to be answered would have to be answered in it. And for tonight there was nothing left to do but sit with the full and undiminished weight of everything he now understood about himself. He sat with it. He didn't look away. Dante did not sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed until the fog outside began to thin, and the first gray suggestion of morning pressed itself against the windows. And then he stood, went to the bathroom, washed the dried blood from his knuckles with cold water and soap, and looked at himself in the mirror for longer than he usually allowed. The face that looked back at him was familiar in its architecture and foreign in everything else. Same jaw, same eyes, same lines that had been deepening since his mid-30s, but something behind all of it had shifted in the night, the way furniture shifts during an earthquake, each piece still recognizable, and nothing quite where it had been. He changed his shirt. He went downstairs. The kitchen was already active, one of the household staff moving quietly through the morning routines. Coffee brewing, the smell of it filling the lower floor with something ordinary and almost unbearably normal, given the condition of the east wing and the garden, and the 2 empty chairs that would be at the organizational table for the next several weeks, while their occupants recovered in hospital beds. Dante poured a cup and stood at the counter and drank it without sitting down, looking at the window above the sink that faced the east garden. The garden looked like a garden again in the morning light. Wet grass, bare November hedges, the maintenance structure at the far end, where Sorrento's men had positioned themselves. From this distance, and in this light, it was simply a structure, a thing made of concrete and utility. It did not look like a place where the night had pivoted. Rocco came in at 7:15, moving with the careful economy of a man who had also not slept and had made his peace with that. He poured coffee and leaned against the opposite counter, and they stood in the kitchen in the early morning quiet, and the silence between them was different from the silences of the previous 11 years. Not the silence of a subordinate deferring to a superior, but something more level, more honest. How bad is the East Wing? Dante said. Structural damage to 2 door frames and the floor in the secondary corridor. 1 window completely gone. Everything else is cosmetic. Rocco drank his coffee. Peralta has a crew coming at 8. Good. Another silence. You should know, Rocco said, that I would have told you. About my arrangement with Serafina. If you'd ever asked me directly, if you'd ever sat down with me and asked what I actually knew about how this organization operated, I would have told you. Dante looked at him. You would have. Yes. Why didn't you volunteer it? Rocco considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because you never gave me the impression you wanted to know anything you hadn't already decided. He said it without cruelty. Just accurately, you asked for execution, Dante. For 11 years you asked me to execute decisions you had already made. A man stops offering analysis when analysis isn't what's being requested. Dante set his cup down on the counter. He looked at the window for a moment. That changes. I know, Rocco said. That's why I'm telling you now. At 8:30, Harlan Foss arrived at the estate carrying a leather briefcase and the expression of a man who had been awake all night, completing legal work and had survived to report on it. He was 63 years old with the kind of face that had stopped being readable sometime in his 40s, and he shook Dante's hand in the entrance hall with a grip that was firm and completely without apology for any of it. The dissolution is filed, Harlan said. The trust is legally extinguished as of 6:14 this morning. The Indianapolis copies were destroyed, and I have written confirmation from 3 partners at the firm. The account restructuring your people attempted in Luxembourg has been reversed and the original architecture restored. He opened the briefcase and produced a single manila envelope. These are the last physical documents relating to the trust. What you do with them is your decision. Dante took the envelope. Thank you, Harlan. Harlan nodded. There was a pause in which the older man seemed to be weighing something. Then he said, Your father was a complicated man. He made decisions that were not always comprehensible in the moment they were made, but he was right about her. He nodded toward the upper floor. He was right from the first time he met her. He told me that the day after your engagement was announced. He picked up his briefcase. I thought you should know that. He left. Dante stood in the entrance hall with the manila envelope in his hands, and the morning light coming through the front windows. And he thought about his father, about a man who had built a dead man's switch out of legal architecture and family obligation, and the specific, clear-eyed assessment of the woman his son was going to marry, and who had trusted that assessment more than he had trusted his own son's eventual judgment. He went upstairs. The elder meeting was held in the main dining room at 10 o'clock, at the same table where the dinner had been held 2 nights ago, 2 days that felt like a geological era, a period of time that had compressed and reshaped everything it touched. The 7 elders were present. Rocco was present. 3 of the 4 district captains were present, the 4th being Ferretti, whose chair was conspicuously empty and would remain so. Raphael sat at the far end of the table, in the chair of someone who knows his position is provisional and is not pretending otherwise. Serafina sat at the head. She was wearing black, not the performative black of mourning, but the practical black of someone who has work to do and has dressed for it. Her hair was back. She had the manila folders that Harlan had prepared, the dissolution documents, the account confirmations, the intelligence summary on the Sorrento network. She had everything organized and present, and she looked, Dante thought as he took his seat to her left, like someone who had been preparing for this particular morning for a very long time and had arrived at it without surprise. Dante put the manila envelope from Harlan on the table in front of him. He did not open it. Elder Carmine Voss spoke first because he always spoke first, and because at 71 He had earned the right to set the temperature of any room he entered. Before we begin, he said, looking at Serafina, I want to say something on behalf of the elders. He paused. We knew, not everything, but enough. We knew where the real lines of authority ran in this organization, and we made a choice 11 years ago to allow the arrangement to function as it had functioned because it was functioning, because the family was stable and the operations were sound and the alliances were maintained. His eyes moved to Dante. And we watched you run in the wrong direction for a long time, and we did not say anything, and that is our accounting. We added to the table this morning. Dante looked at Carmine Voss, at the oldest and most permanent presence at this table, and understood that the confession was not an apology. It was an accounting, offered with the precision of men who understood that a full reckoning requires all the ledgers open, not just the most dramatic ones. I hear it, Dante said. Serafina opened the first folder. The meeting ran for 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was not a comfortable 2 hours and 40 minutes. Serafina walked the table through the full architecture of what had happened: the Sorrento network, Celeste's operational role, Ferretti's communications, Raphael's arrangement, the trust mechanism and its dissolution. She presented it the way a surgeon presents a diagnosis. Completely, without softening, with the understanding that incomplete information leads to incomplete treatment. When she reached Raphael, she paused and looked at him directly. You'll speak now, she said. Raphael spoke for 12 minutes. He said what he had told Dante in the sitting room, the lawyer's office, the funeral eulogy, the 13 years of carrying it. He did not ask for understanding. He laid the facts down on the table and left them there. When he finished, the room was quiet. Elder Voss looked at Serafina. Your recommendation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Raphael Veyron surrenders his position in the Western District. He will work directly under organizational oversight for a period of not less than 2 years, with full transparency of activity and communication. End of that period, the elders will assess. She paused. He is family. Family does not disappear when it fails. It answers for the failure and rebuilds. Raphael looked at her from the end of the table. Something in his face shifted, not relief, not gratitude exactly, but the specific expression of a man who has been given something he had not dared to expect and does not yet know what to do with it. Agreed, said Voss. The other elders nodded. Then Voss looked at Dante. Dante had known this moment was coming since Serafina had asked him to be present, and he had spent the hours between the sitting room and this table deciding what to say, and he had arrived at the conclusion that the only thing worth saying was the thing he would have paid almost price 24 hours ago to avoid saying in front of these men. He reached into the manila envelope and took out the trust documents, the originals, his father's signature on the last page, and laid them flat on the table where the elders could see them. My father built this, Dante said, because he knew what I was capable of. Not in the sense of capacity, he believed in that, but in the sense of character. He knew I was capable of making the organization about myself, of mistaking the visibility of authority for the substance of it. He looked at the document. He was right. I did exactly what he was afraid of. I made an 11-year project of running this family as if it were a possession, and I surrounded myself with a performance of loyalty instead of the real thing, and I was planning to discard the one person who had been holding the structural reality of this organization together since before I sat at this table. He looked up. That is my accounting. The room absorbed it. And your recommendation, said Voss, for yourself. Dante looked at Serafina. She was looking at him with the expression he had been studying since the night before, still reading, still assessing, but something in it had opened a fraction, an aperture. Not forgiveness, not yet, possibly not ever, in the form he might once have wanted it. Something. That's not my decision, Dante said. I made decisions unilaterally for 11 years, and I'm done making them unilaterally. Whatever role I have in this organization going forward is determined by the people at this table, not by me." Another silence. Voss looked at Serafina. She looked at the table for a moment, then at Dante. "You'll work with Rocco on organizational restructuring. Captain positions need to be filled, and the district boundaries redrawn after what happened with Ferretti. That takes 3 to 6 months, and it requires someone who knows the operational history." She paused. "You know it better than anyone." "In what capacity?" "In my capacity," she said. "You report to me. Every significant decision goes through this table. You have authority over execution, not direction." She held his gaze. "Can't work within that structure." "I can," he said. She held his gaze for one more second. Then she looked down at her folder and moved to the next item. It was the most ordinary pivot imaginable from the moment that had reorganized his entire organizational business, and the ordinariness of it was, Dante realized, exactly right. This was not a scene. This was administration. The emotional reckoning had happened in corridors and parking lots, and quiet rooms in the dark. And this was the morning after. And the morning after required work. Picked up a pen and began taking notes. The meeting concluded at 12:40. The elders stood, and there were the brief exchanges of men who have been in difficult rooms together and emerged with the specific wordless solidarity that such rooms produce. Voss shook Dante's hand on the way out, a real handshake, both hands. The kind that says, "I see what you did in there and it counted." Dante received it without performing humility and without performing confidence. He just received it. Raphael was the last to leave the dining room. He stood at the door for a moment and looked back at Dante, and there was something between them that did not have a clean name, and probably never would not forgiveness. Not alliance, not the easy restoration of family warmth. Something more complicated and more durable. The specific bond of two people who have seen each other at their worst and are still in the room. Raphael nodded. Dante nodded back. The door closed. Serafina was still at the head of the table, collecting her folders, moving through the post-meeting mechanics with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Dante remained in his chair. The room was empty, except for the two of them, and the remains of the morning's work spread across the table. "Celeste," Dante said. Serafina looked up. "What happens to her?" Serafina set her folders down. "I delivered a package to a federal contact this morning, before the meeting. Everything we have on her network, her arrangement with Sorrento, the account access she was building. The federal contact has been waiting for a clean case against Elia Sorrento for 18 months. She paused. "Celeste's cooperation will be strongly encouraged as part of the arrangement." "Will she cooperate?" "She's a pragmatist. When her lawyers explain her options, she'll cooperate." Serafina picked her folders back up. "She'll be out of the country within a year in a witness arrangement that keeps her comfortable and keeps her quiet. Cleaner than the alternative." Dante thought about Celeste, about the red dress, and the performance of warmth, and the 14 months of construction behind it, and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite pity, but contained elements of both. "I should have seen it." "Yes," Serafina said without cruelty. "You should have." He appreciated that she didn't soften it. "Come." In the space of one night, to appreciate her directness, the way you appreciate a clean incision, it hurts, but it's faster. And it heals cleaner than something that was handled gently but badly. He stood from the table. "The East Wing," he said. "Pairs will take how long?" Peralta said a week for the structural work. 2 more for the cosmetic. "I'll oversee it." She looked at him. "You don't need to. I know I don't need to." He gathered the trust documents from the table, put them back in the manila envelope. "I want to. It's my house. I should know what's been broken in it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. He walked to the door. "Dante," he turned. She was still at the head of the table, standing straight, one hand resting on the stack of folders, the morning light coming in through the dining room windows and falling across her at an angle that was neither dramatic nor contrived. Just the light at this hour in this room, ordinary and clear. The organizational code, she said. What the family operates under going forward. Loyalty earned, not inherited. I'm putting it in writing, a formal document that every captain and elder signs. She paused. I'd like you to help me draft it. He stood in the doorway with the envelope in his hand and the morning light between them. Why me? Because you know better than anyone what happens when that principle is ignored. She said it evenly, with no edge on it. And because the people who need to read it will read it differently, knowing your name is on it. He thought about that. About what his name meant, now not the authority it had carried before, which had been the borrowed authority of a man who had mistaken inheritance for legitimacy, but what it might mean going forward if he did the work of meaning something different. All right, he said. She nodded and looked back at her folders, and he walked out into the corridor and pulled the door closed behind him. The weeks that followed were the quietest of Dante's adult life, and not a comfortable quiet. It was the quiet of a man doing work that requires attention, rather than performance. The East Wing repairs, the restructuring meetings with Rocco, the long operational reviews that filled the afternoons, with the kind of granular organizational detail that he had spent 11 years delegating downward. He was in the building every day. He was in the rooms where the work happened, not the rooms where the authority was displayed. He and Serafina worked on the organizational code in the evenings, at the desk in her study, which he now entered by knocking and waiting for her answer. The drafting took 3 weeks. They argued about language, twice real arguments, not the careful negotiations of two people managing their own power, but the genuine friction of two people who see something differently and are trying to find the version that is actually true. Both arguments were resolved by one of them being right and the other one eventually acknowledging it, and each time Dante was wrong. He said so without performance, and each time Serafina was wrong, she did the same. It was, he thought, the most honestly they had ever communicated in 11 years of marriage. He did not know what the marriage was now. He did not ask, because the question was too large for the fragile and newly constructed trust between them, and because he had learned, finally and at considerable cost, the difference between demanding an answer and earning the right to receive one. He showed up. He did the work. He stayed. Elia Sorrento was indicted on federal charges 6 weeks after the night of the estate. Celeste Arden cooperated fully, as Serafina had predicted, and her testimony dismantled the Sorrento network's financial architecture with the precision of someone who had spent 14 months learning every detail of it. The federal case took another 8 months to complete, but its outcome was never seriously in doubt. Ferretti received 7 years. He served them. Raphael completed his first year under oversight, without incident and without complaint. He ran logistics for the Northern District under Rocco's supervision, and he was good at it, methodical, careful, the kind of worker who anticipates problems before they require management. At the end of the second year, the elders reinstated him to a limited district role. He did not ask for more. Dante noticed and thought about the 17-year-old boy in the lawyer's office, and what the old man had said about trusting him, and thought that his father had perhaps been right about Raphael too. The organizational code was signed by every elder and captain on a Tuesday afternoon in the main dining room, at the same table where all of it had begun. Serafina sat at the head. Dante sat to her left. The document went around the table, person by person, each signature its own small commitment, and when it came back to the head of the table, Serafina signed it last, with the same pen she had used to dissolve the trust document the morning after the night that had reorganized everything. She set the pen down. Voss, sitting across from her, looked at the signed document, and then looked at the room and said simply, "Good." The way an old man says good when he means something has been settled that needed settlings, and he is glad to have lived to see it, and he is not going to say more than that, because more than that would be theater. People began to stand and move, and the room filled with the ordinary sounds of a meeting concluding. Dante stayed in his chair. Serafina was collecting the document, the pen, the folders, the administrative residue of the afternoon. She glanced at him as the room emptied. "You're not leaving." In a minute, she finished collecting and sat back down across from him, one chair to his right, at a slight angle so they were not quite facing each other, and not quite not. The room emptied around them until it was just the two of them and the afternoon light and the signed document between them on the table. Dante looked at the document, at the two names on the signature line, hers, full and certain his, underneath it, in the handwriting of a man who had learned to write his name in a different context than the one he was born into. "My father believed in you before I did," he said. "He knew what you were from the beginning. He built the contingency because he knew me well enough not to trust me with the thing he'd already recognized in you." He looked up. "I spent 11 years in the same house and didn't see what he saw across one conversation." Serafina was quiet for a moment. "He saw it because he was looking," she said. "You weren't. I know. You're looking now." "Yes." She looked at him, the full, careful, reading attention she brought to everything, and he held it without deflecting, without constructing anything over the top of it. Just sat there and let her see what was there to see. Whatever she saw, she kept to herself. But something in her posture changed a fraction. A small release of something that had been held for a very long time, at great cost. Not warmth, not yet, but the possibility of warmth, the degree before warmth. She stood and picked up her folders. "There's a captain meeting tomorrow at 9, she said. "Northern District Boundary Review. I'll need you there." "I'll be there." She walked toward the door. Serafina stopped, did not turn, but stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for not leaving when you had every reason to." A pause, long enough to breathe through. "I didn't stay for you," she said quietly. "I stayed for this." She meant the organization, the family, the thing that had existed before both of them and would exist after. He understood that. He accepted it without demanding it be something else. She walked out. Dante sat alone at the head of the family table in the afternoon light, with the signed organizational code in front of him and the house quiet around him, and he understood finally and completely what his father had known and what had taken him 11 years and one catastrophic night to learn: that authority without accountability is just performance, that power without loyalty is just noise, and that the most important thing a man can do with what he has been given is earn the right to keep it. He was not the head of the Veyron family. He sat at its table. For the first time in his adult life, he understood the difference. And he understood that the difference was everything. He picked up the organizational code, folded it carefully, and went to find the room where the work was.